welcome to Health Issues. I'm your host, Chris Sylvain, and we are thoroughly excited about today. Believe me, we have a great guest on, and believe me, the whole city knows her well. I truly believe that. She is attorney Tracie Washington. Welcome. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you, and thank you for having me on the show.
Well, we are honored, really. We've been watching through the years, really making an impact, a positive way on our city. We're here to actually talk about schools and violence in schools, and I can't think of anybody better that can address this from the community standpoint. But before we do that, tell us a little bit about kind of take us through this career real quick, just a quick snapshot through it.
Well, most people know me for my post-Katrina, and it's interesting how we measure our lives, right, in New Orleans, pre-Katrina and post-Katrina. Right. So I've been practicing law for about 27 years, however, mostly labor and employment and school law. Okay. Prior to Hurricane Katrina. For a while I served as the general counsel for the New Orleans public schools, and so I've been representing schools and school leaders, educators for almost all of my career. Right after Hurricane Katrina, I worked for and I opened the NAACP's Gulf Coast Advocacy Center here in New Orleans, and we did a lot of work, really individual work, helping survivors of Katrina on individual issues, be it housing, education, and then larger social justice issues surrounding African Americans and their return to New Orleans. Part of that was education advocacy. And then after the NAACP's office closed, we opened the Louisiana Justice Institute, myself, another attorney, Steve Jupiter, and Jacques Moriel. And we worked on a lot of social justice and civil rights issues surrounding health and hospitals, the litigation to reopen charity and public housing issues, and of course, education advocacy, because we had huge issues around the reopening of schools, school governance, special education, and all of those issues. And so, as the product of two educators, schools have been prominent in my life, all of my life.
That's amazing. We were talking earlier about we're both in a Hyatt hotel and how yes. Katrina has so much defined life forever. I think.
Oh my goodness, yeah. You know, the knuckleheads who chose to stay.
Yeah, we did. We just did.
Dyed in the wool with this, and so this issue and the school violence issue is, you know, it's pretty near and dear to my heart, but also to the community.
Well, I'm just thinking, where it started was we happened to meet with some young people. It was actually young men. They wanted to kind of meet with us and just kind of talk about issues. What dominated the conversation for these young men was school violence.
Yes.
It trumped grades and everything. What happened is that whether they were able to work through it themselves or not. These were not scary guys. I mean, they could handle themselves very well. But the issue was it dominates the school system. And obviously not all schools, because schools where you can just throw people out, that's different. But it dominates their life, whether they have to fight that day. And the thing we started looking at it is that, well, who's focusing on this? Sure. It seems as though the schools are like the prisons. Just throw them in there, and if they beat themselves up, that's on them. Who cares?
Well, you know, I step back, you know, as a mother of a now adult 23-year-old male, and when I hear these stories, and you, Chris, talk about this, I think for a second, this perspective they must have from probably age 5, maybe even earlier going forward, of today I might have to fight, and how that frames their entire lives. What that means when you walk out of your door, presuming there's safety in your home, and know between your front stairs and getting to school, there may be violence that you're enveloped with in the streets. That place that normally children in our country should see as a safe haven, this school, this a safe space, is now also a place where you can see so much violence. And from their eyes, what else is there? Your being, your existence is not education. It is simply surviving the violence that may come to you during the day. And so from my perspective as an education advocate, I look at school violence as a part of community violence. And, you know, how is it that we, not just as educators or as advocates, but as an entire community, work to provide safe spaces for these young men?
But looking at it, and I was thrown aback, and I will say that, you know, and I've had teenagers and so forth, and I'll say honestly, maybe the kids that I've been around have been in schools where violence is not an issue.
Sure.
But my eyes were open that these kids are saying, hey, that's not our school. And what it makes me think is that maybe they're speaking from the majority. Maybe it's the minority in schools that won't have that level of violence. And so where's the data? Who's doing the surveys? Yes. You know what I mean? Are we quantifying this, even, let alone trying to solve it?
Well, and in response to your questions, because that's all that I think about, sure, there are some organizations that do some surveys. But I don't know, and I posit that we won't cure just community violence, or, you know, get ourselves to this situation where we're feeling safe in the community, because all we hear about in the news is, you know, putting more police out on the streets and dealing with the fact that in New Orleans we have the highest rate of incarceration in the state and in the country, meaning in the world. All of that, you know, stems from us not dealing with the causes of the violence in the first place. And then the next question is, when we get the data, Chris, what do we do with it, right? What do we do with the data once we get it? And I don't know that I have the answer to that, but what I do feel, from my perspective as a civil rights attorney, we have to address the civil rights aspect of this, in my perspective, which is we have too many haves and have-nots in this community. Those children are entitled to this free and appropriate public education, and it should not be that because you're in one part of town you don't get educated because you're dealing with violence, or because you're at this charter school that has poor management, you are not educated because of the violence. Some folks, I think, need to be held accountable.
And that's the point, because again, hey, community violence, you know, say the mayor and the police chief and everybody else can make a million excuses. But in a school, once you walk into that door, that these kids have a right to be educated, then at that point, to me, the school board should be held accountable. The principal should be held accountable, and the answer shouldn't be locking the kids up and sending them to jail. And that's increasing the school-to-prison pipeline, and it's not that deep. I mean, we got social workers, and we can bring in people. There's a whole lot of army of people that can go in, but we're having a grading system based upon test scores and ACT when the kids are saying, wait, am I safe or not? That's not the grades we need to be published on the one app gadget. Mm-hmm. You know, let's get that survey to say, well, these kids, 85% of the kids feel safe at this school, and let's combine that with that grade issue, and then I think we'll get a true representation.
Well, most certainly a representation of what that school environment is like. From their perspective, what is it that they would like to see in the schools? When you were speaking with these young students, did they offer you proposed solutions from their eyes? I'm always curious about hearing from their perspective versus me, or you for that matter, just presuming this is what should happen. Like, you know, many people would say, okay, well, we put more guards in schools.
Right.
Is that what they want?
No, and we dealt with that. Not that they had a direct answer, but the feeling that the system has failed them was pervasive.
Okay.
Okay. They recognized right away that something was wrong with the adults, and they looked at us, because basically, if we as the adults in the community allow kids to be beat up, abused, ought to have to beat up others to keep from being beat up. You know what I mean? Whatever method they have to use to deal with it, then this is a societal failure. And nobody should be able to sleep at night as long as we have kids going through this. So the answer, obviously, is basic. They didn't say it directly because out of respect and love, but what I heard was you and everybody else need to be in that school trying to make sure things are tight.
Well, and there are schools that have, tremendous successes with curbing violence or quashing beefs before they even get there. And so we know that there are models where there is school success, and not necessarily, okay, it's a private school or a parochial school. I work with the King School District, and there are social workers, there are school interventionists. They work on what's called a Comer model, so that all hands are on deck. It's not just simply the teachers who are involved in educating, but every administrator and staff person has the responsibility of knowing all of the students in that school, and that's a pre-K through 12 environment, and understanding, what's going on in his or her day. Because often you don't know what children are coming to school with. So many fights at schools nowadays are the result of actions and activities that took place off-site, right? And so it's imperative for educators, on the one hand, to be aware of what's going on in their student body. As administrators and as boards, I think it's incumbent upon this community and those districts to ensure that they're not mixing cultures that should not mix, right? I understand several years ago with after the Landry-Walker merger, the Recovery School District sort of threw into the mix of that student body students from lots of schools that had been high schools that had been closed in the community. And Chris, while we might want to say, well, that shouldn't be a problem, school students, large group of students from this school and large group of students from this school should be able to, integrate into another community, where do we know that that's successful, right? Yes. I mean, in what circumstance, really, is that successful? So why should we anticipate that or expect that students should be able to do that wholesale, 200 or 300 at a time, and there not be difficulties? So it shouldn't happen, but at the very least, when we have circumstances that, out of people's control, we have to do this, we have to get kids educated, we should be prepared. Sort of like, heck of a job Brownie, FEMA, whomever, we should be prepared for, what we know could be an impending disaster, conflicts. Have the conflict resolution specialists there. Offer different programs during the evening, possibly. Do platoons. We did that type of work prior to Hurricane Katrina, and we need to look back, Chris, I would say, to those, older generation educators.
The ones that got fired.
The ones, right, exactly, the ones that we terminated, but who have institutional knowledge and knowledge of the community and our children, and talk with them about how we can reduce the incidence of violence in the schools.
Well, I mean, just like in any other situation, though, if a school is already on notice for being unsafe, say if all the kids say, hey, I don't feel safe at this school, from a court standpoint, should that school be held accountable for allowing an unsafe environment? That, hey, they have lost control of the school. So many teachers have lost control of the classroom, whether the fights happen after school, before school, on school grounds or not. It's based on social media and a whole bunch of foolishness. And all right, we know the kids
talk about
trouble.
That as well, yeah.
Yeah,
Sure. Well, it's interesting, I love suing people, and so as you're talking, I'm sort of trying to think of a cause of action and some sort of, litigation for those students that you're talking about at that school. I'm thinking, well, maybe, is there some sort of failure to supervise? Obviously, litigation is the last place you want to be. You want to bet.
Right.
sometimes you have to do things. Sometimes there's impact litigation simply, and we've done that with Louisiana Justice Institute, in order to make a point. Sometimes you may know that you might not get far, but if you get far enough and you bring attention to an issue, you can get systemic change. And I think you've touched on something else that we do need to address as a community. What is being brought in the schools, and what are the students being taught at home? There are supervision issues at home that we can't ignore. We as educators, and myself as an attorney for a school district, we often deal with the violence that parents bring to schools. And that's a huge issue when we talk just in terms of violence in school. It's violence by students, sometimes violence with staff, and increasingly violence with parents.
Well, let's bring mass incarceration in. If we have some estimates in some neighborhoods, up to 70% of the young men are incarcerated at any given time. A third are going to be incarcerated anyway. So we know we have huge numbers, mass incarceration capital of the world. So prisons are violent.
Sure.
So the neighborhoods are violent. You know, much of the economy may be outside of the mainstream. So we're dealing with, violence upon violence. But the schools are run by the state, or the city, or the district, or whoever. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, the schools can't just cop out and say, we're bringing in a bunch of kids who are accustomed to violence, so therefore the school will be violent.
Of course not. I don't presume to be an educator or a social worker, psychologist, but we do know that there are tools available to assist, right? And every child shouldn't have to go to alternative school just simply because they've been involved in some sort of altercation, or for that matter, what we'd experienced in this community for far too long, which were many of the charter schools just simply sending kids home and either under suspension or expulsion, or simply just saying you can go home now as a cop-out, because at the end of the day we are required to educate. It's not rocket science, but it is difficult, right? And it requires not simply the school, but the entire community. You're going to ultimately, you're working with what you're brought. And I just don't know how far a school can get with that without community support. Do parents need counseling? If they do, then we've got to make sure that those parents are counseled. I mean, think about it. When we release individuals from incarceration in this state, Chris, they're required to do some form of reentry program. Why? So that individual not only learns about the community that they're going to be entering, but also so that prison officials and those social workers can learn about that individual's family. Maybe that individual shouldn't go back into that community, or what they're supposed to be doing is working now with that community. Maybe mom needs some mental health services. Let's get them for mom. Maybe dad's unemployed. Let's see if we can send dad to some, agencies where he can maybe find employment. If I know as an educator that child's coming back to me, but coming from that environment, and I'm working on the child, I know that I'm not going to be successful unless I'm also providing some services for that extended community. We don't fund that in this state. And we know that the problems exist, and we need to fund it. If we're saying, well, those services are out there, okay, fine, but if individuals aren't, benefiting from those services or know about those services, we've got to then provide some resources for the schools so that we can help these kids.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I think that's it. It's not rocket science. We have some of the best universities in the country right here. We got tons of this academic medical centers. I mean, right. So we have all of the big guns to come in. I cannot see a school saying, hey, we need community support. We need some men to come over. I cannot see a school not getting tons of men that want to come in and help if we can identify the problem.
Right. And I mean, sure, that's the $64,000 question, the elephant in the room, right? Is it just one problem or a myriad of problems? And that's really what we've got to hit. Not only there, big picture, but at each school site, because we don't know what the problems are at any individual school, right?
Yeah. But I guess that's where it becomes where it doesn't seem to be a published place where we can go look at the problem.
Sure.
We can see ACT scores. That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. But as far as incidents of violence in a school, you know, unless you are looking for suspension and expulsion data from an individual school, you may not be able to see specifically the incidents of violence. For example, some schools may actually do the right thing and figure out how to deal with incidents of violence. And when I say incidents of violence, I'm thinking in terms of just fighting. I'm not thinking or talking in terms of what we may see in the greater New Orleans community, like gunfights and this, that, and the other. Right. I don't know of those incidents in schools, but most certainly fighting and also, you know, bullying are huge, right? And is it documented where we can pull that data? I don't know. I don't know of that resource.
And if you don't know,
but it's something I most certainly would want to you know, to examine, and maybe it could very well be that simply finding the data and understanding or educating in those specific schools, re-educating, providing additional resources for those teachers and administrators could provide the assistance these students need. At the end of the day, they're not going to be able to get out of school if they're not learning because of the violence, right? So that would be the vicious cycle.
Yeah, and then in choosing schools, I mean, it's tons of bus ads and ads all over the billboard saying, "Come to my school." Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? We did this, but is your school violent?
Is it safe? Is it a safe community? And that, I mean, that's a critical question, and it should be something that is published. Now, there is a New Orleans public school sort of data book that the name is escaping me right now, but I don't know if that information is referenced in that publication. It's important. I agree with you.
And then expulsion and suspension data may not correlate with whether the kids feel safe or not.
You're right, and that's a very interesting point. Right now, that's the metric we're talking about because that's the only metric I can think of. Right. But you may not be. You may be dealing with activities that are not necessarily in school, but outside of school. From school, you know, someone picks a fight or calls you a name or you begin being bullied. What happens once you leave the school grounds? Necessarily, the incident and the violence began at school. What responsibility then does the school have to deal with that? Some administrators take that on and they work even if an incident happened outside of school. Some don't. Some parents get very upset when schools then discipline students for incidents that happened outside of schools. And so we've got all of these things to weigh. I've represented a parent once who was really concerned because her child was suspended for a fight that happened after school over the weekend. They got back to school on Monday. The administrators put both students on suspension for that fight. Mm-hmm. Their argument was, why are you suspending them for a fight that happened outside of school? And we dealt with that situation. I'm not sure if we're asking schools to then deal with violence in general, school violence, that we can't then say, you know, they have the right and the authority to discipline students for activities that happened outside of school if they perceive it's going to affect the school environment and that culture. So they're, I mean, pretty heavy issues.
Yeah, well, you know, and then we throw in social media, Snapchat and Instagram.
Most certainly.
Where that's what I heard from the kids. Literally, all of the issues started on social media.
Absolutely.
It's a whole different world. So place doesn't matter anymore. The fight could happen on the internet.
All the time.
The instigation of it. So
lots of girl fights start that way. You know, I've been in rooms with young ladies and parents, and you know, how did this fight begin? Oh well, you know, this one was seen with this one's boyfriend, or this, that, and the other. And you know, I generally start with, you know, most of these boys don't brush their teeth. Why is it that you're fighting over them? You know, but you know, just to sort of break the ice. But it is an amazing thing how stuff can blow up, and just in that way. And then again, even if it happened over the weekend, even if it happened over the summer, those issues are brought back onto the school site.
Now watch this. But if our kids, if everybody went to Lusher, we wouldn't have that issue. Because I talked to some kids from Lusher, and they said, no, they don't have a fight problem. They'll kick them out. So if you go to Lusher, or if you go to John Mack, who they had the TV program about, so are you entitled to a whole different level of safety?
You are guaranteed maybe a level of safety because of some people may say a draconian discipline policy. You know, maybe there it's a one strike, right? But at the end of the day, our community, our state is required to educate those students. And so just recirculating dirty bath water isn't going to help, you know, the child get clean. It's just dirty bath water. We've got to figure out how to clean it. And I don't know, and I won't cast aspersions on Lusher in general, but we do have a problem.
Look, and you're the right person. Health issues, fight as hard as you can. These are our children. It may not be your biological child, but these are our children, and they have cried for help. They have asked for it in any way, shape, or form. I believe it's up to you and everybody else to make a difference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.